Did you know there used to be a Muslim sultanate in the heart of China? You see, in the early 1200s, China was a much smaller country with its majority population consisting of the Han Chinese. And to the southwest of it was an even smaller kingdom, which the Chinese called Yunnan. It was a nation full of diverse languages and peoples that were completely different from the Han people of China. But the distinction between these two nations wouldn't matter for long, as by the end of the century, the Mongols would invade both kingdoms as part of their empire that reached from China in the east all the way to Iraq and Persia in the west. In 1258, the Mongols sacked the city of Baghdad, putting an end to the Abbasid Caliphate. In the years following, the Mongols would bring warriors and governors and skilled craftsmen from the Muslim lands and use them to help strengthen their rule over Yunnan and China. Soon, a class system emerged where the Muslims were put at the top, just beneath the Mongol elite, and Muslim governors were appointed to rule over the various districts of China. The most famous of these governors was Sayyid Ajal Shamsuddin Umar al-Bukhari, who ruled over Yunnan. He was a Persian Muslim who was known as a just ruler and who gave da'wah to the locals while greatly expanding the influence of Muslims in the province. This would eventually give a distinctive Muslim-influenced culture to the region, and many of China's most famous Muslims would eventually come from there. But all of the conquering and pillaging the Mongols had done to the Muslims would catch up with them and eventually lead to their downfall. In 1368, with the help of elite Muslim generals and soldiers, a Han Chinese warrior called the Hongwu Emperor managed to overthrow the Mongols and take control of China. In the final stages of the war, the Mongols held the territory of Yunnan, and in 1381, the Hongwu Emperor sent an army of both Han Chinese and Hui Muslims to take control of the region and defeat the Mongols once and for all. These Hui Muslims were descendants of the Persians and Arabs from the west who had intermarried with the Han Chinese population. The only difference now between the Han and the Hui was that the Hui were Muslim. Yunnan was now incorporated into China, and by the mid-1600s, the Han Chinese would become the majority population. But still, Yunnan managed to maintain a unique culture separate from the rest of China, from both its indigenous history and its huge Muslim population. During this period, Han Chinese and Hui Muslims had amicable relations, generally living in harmony with one another, but that relationship would soon change when a new wave of Han migrants began to arrive between 1775 and 1850. Copper and silver was discovered in the region, and new mines were being built to harvest the precious metals, and in response, Han Chinese flocked to Yunnan to work in these mines. This new generation of Han Chinese were not used to the ethnic diversity of Yunnan, and they began forming bandit gangs called incense brotherhoods, where they would swear allegiance to each other while burning sticks of incense. These gangs would then steal and harass the Hui Muslims, leading to decades of ethnic tension between the Han and Hui. Eventually, this all came to a boiling point when in October 1845, in the city of Baoshan, Han bandits vandalized a local masjid. In response, the Muslims of that village formed their own gang in retaliation. The Han Chinese then, fearing that the Hui would get their revenge after years of attacks, sent bandits to attack the city and massacred 8,000 Hui Muslims. But what they didn't realize was that one of the men who had survived that very massacre would go on to build an Islamic sultanate in the heart of China. And by the way, if you want to support the channel and help me pay my editors, you can sign up for my Patreon, link in the YouTube video description or on my TikTok profile. Anyway, over the next few years, tensions rose significantly, but it was not just between the Han bandits and the Hui Muslims. The Chinese government at the time had shown support for the gangs, and it was later found out that the rulers of Baoshan had actually been complicit in the massacre, allowing it to take place. But what was interesting about the situation was that the Chinese government wasn't actually Han Chinese. At the time, a new government had been formed by the Manchus, foreigners who had come from the northeast and were becoming increasingly unpopular amongst Han Chinese. Only 5 years later, the biggest and most deadly rebellion in the history of China began, aimed at overthrowing the Manchu rule. This encouraged Du Wenxiu, and he began calling both the Hui Muslims and the Han Chinese to unite against the Manchus, seeing them as ultimately responsible for the attacks against the Muslim. But there was still one more event yet to take place that would catapult his efforts into a full-blown rebellion. In 1856, an official in Kunming, the capital city of Yunnan, managed to seize power in the city. He was mentally unstable and extremely anti-Hui, and he formed a Han militia to eradicate the Muslims in and around the city. Another 8,000 Muslims were killed in the Kunming massacre, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Local uprisings from both Han and Hui eventually spread across the entire province, which Du Wenxiu managed to unite under his command. Together they captured the city of Dali, forming their own government and their own army and ruling by the laws of Islam. They called their new state the Pingnangguo Sultanate. For the next 16 years, he fought against the Manchu government, expanding his sultanate across the western half of Yunnan, and alongside him joined another group of Hui rebels led by their general, Ma Rulong. In 1862, Ma Rulong and his forces feigned defeat and surrendered to the Manchu army, hoping to gain access to the enemy stronghold of Kunming. From there, Ma Rulong occupied the old capital city, but to test his loyalty, the Manchu government sent him on a mission to put down a rebellion in another city. Ma Rulong left Kunming with his troops, and a group of them mutinied against him and then joined Du Wenxiu, believing that Ma Rulong had betrayed the cause. Cracks were now beginning to appear in the rebellion, and the Manchus were able to use Ma Rulong and his Hui Muslim army to attack Du Wenxiu and his Yunnan Sultanate. Their policy of using Muslims to fight other Muslims was working, and the Pingnangguo Sultanate was beginning to shrink. In 1872, the Manchu troops managed to capture the city of Dali and sack it, massacring the entire Hui population of men, women, and children. 10,000 people were killed, and Du Wenxiu himself was captured and beheaded. After a decade and a half of rule, the man who had started it all was now dead. The only Muslim sultanate to have ever existed in the heart of China was now finally over. Like and follow for more Muslim facts.